بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. Before we begin, I want to express my thanks to the excellent authorities of this mosque for their very generous permission to allow our sisters who are with us to sit here at our side. And I want to ask all of our brothers to observe correct etiquette. Our topic tonight is extremism. In a global context, I'm not really sure if we'll get there. It's a big topic. Technically speaking, this is a lecture, but I'm not here to lecture to you. I'm not here to tell you what is what. I'm here for us to look at this phenomenon and, if time permits, to discuss it. Because this is the issue of the time, isn't it? This is what we see in the newspapers, this is what we hear about. So this is an important topic, and it is a very difficult topic. It is a very complicated topic. How many of you have heard of Walt Disney? Everybody. Amazing. So what we want to begin with is getting beyond pure Walt Disney. And much of what is said about terrorism and extremism is pure Walt Disney. It has nothing to do with reality. And when we look at this phenomenon, we have to look at it honestly. And we have to look at it from all perspectives. And we have to look at the parts that are ugly, and we have to look at the parts that drive people to these things. And only when we begin to talk about this honestly can we arrive at a solution, in my opinion. What do you think of when you hear the word extremism? A rhetorical question. I don't expect you to answer the question. I like to ask questions and answer them myself. But when I think of extremism as a Muslim, I think, and probably you're the same, of the middle way, which is the way of our Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is it not? Which is as-sirat al-mustaqim, ummatun wasat, the middle nation. God made us a moderate nation, did he not? He made us ummatun wasat, so that we could be what? Shuhada ala nas, so that we could bear witness over mankind, humankind, and so that the Prophet could bear witness over us. And that's what we are. That's what we have been. And that's what we will be. We are ummatun wasat. So when we talk about extremism, we're talking about something that is not in the middle, that's at the extreme, this extreme or that extreme. And from our perspective, it's wrong. Because Islam is in the middle. Islam is just. Islam is fair. We hear this word in the press all the time. So sometimes I ask myself, but what does the other side mean when they use that word? In other words, if I think of extremism and I imagine the middle way, which is what it implies to me as a Muslim and to you, then it may be that other people use the word and they think of something else, such as you are extreme and I am not. That you are incorrect and I am not. That you are guilty and I am not. that the burden's on you and it's not on me. And if that's what is meant by extremism, then I think that's very difficult for all of us to accept. And so when we look at this issue, we do have to look at it honestly, objectively, and we also have to define terms. That any time that someone uses a term with regard to us or themselves, let us know what that term actually means. What do you understand by that, and what do I? As you know, jihad is part of our religion. And jihad has rules of engagement. And jihad is noble. And jihad is a million things. It can be battle with rules of engagement for a just cause. It can be a woman delivering in pregnancy. Jihad means, at its root, three things. That it's difficult, and you have to exert yourself. And it means that the object is good. The goal is good. The thing that you want is worth striving for. And of course, one way to do that in certain situations is in struggle. And no Muslim denies that. That's something very obvious. But we have rules of engagement. There are certain things that we do not do, that we cannot do by the law. And the kind of terrorism that we have seen, radical terrorism that we have seen in recent decades, is unknown in the history of our ummah. This is something very recent. We don't have that parallel in the past. And you could even say that most of it begins in 1983. 1983 and after that. And the inspiration for a lot of that radical terrorism doesn't come from Islam. It comes from leftist ideology. It is leftist techniques. Now, what we want to talk about is what drives people to do that kind of thing. It's not enough just to say that's wrong and it shouldn't be done. It's also necessary for us to consider that what drives people to these limits, what makes this happen. And as the brother said, we have a long history, an ancient legacy, and we have seen much worse in the past. We have seen much worse. But you might agree that in the past we had greater self-confidence. Maybe we had greater faith. Maybe we were able to confront the situations that were before us in a wiser way. But we've seen our history is a long history, and we are a patient people, and we are a people that has to adhere to the way of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Islam is historically the middle way. We have seen extremes in our history, but always we come back to the middle way. We always come back to that. It's like the gyroscope of Islam. We may go a little bit this way, we may go a little bit that way, but the situation corrects itself and ultimately we come back. So, as we continue to talk about this subject, I think something that is very important, to be very honest about this subject, is that extremism never occurs in a vacuum. So this is something that we have to be very clear about. And all of that is what I would say getting beyond pure Walt Disney. Another thing that we have to be very clear about is that Muslims are not generally extremists. The vast majority of Muslims are people of the middle way. They have always been that way. They will always continue to be that way. And we are not the only extremists in the world. There are Jewish extremists, no question about that. There are Christian extremists, no questions about that. There are Hindu extremists. And there are even secular extremists. So, and you can identify these groups. So, one of the things that we can see when we talk about extremism in a global context is that everybody has a share of that pie. And although we suffer from that problem, and we will do something about that problem, we must, after we understand the nature of the problem, it's certainly not uniquely ours. Now, another thing that is very important about extremism is that, and this is part of the getting away from the pure Walt Disney, is that it is not something intrinsic to Islam. In fact, in my point of view, Islam per se is irrelevant. Islam per se is irrelevant. And this is very important. It's not as if this is a natural outgrowth of our religion. It's not. In fact, this is an aberration in the context of our religion, but we have to understand the nature of that. Now, if we look at Jewish extremism, Christian extremism, Hindu extremism, secularist extremism, and Muslim extremism, we'll see that they have certain things in common. First of all, they tend to see the world in black and white. There are no distinctions. There's no gray. It's all this or all that. The world is a dichotomy. There are the good people and there are the bad people. As our president said, the evil ones and the good ones. That's an extremist idea. So it sees the world in black and white. And that's unjust. It's incorrect. It's very important for us to draw distinctions. And it's very important for us to avoid racist generalizations. We need to distinguish, as our Prophet taught us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, between those who are good and those who are bad, those who are evil and those who are not, those who befriend us and those who do not befriend us. The world is not black and white. Another thing about the extremist groups, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, secularist, Hindu, is that there's very strong allegiance to the group itself, and usually antipathy to the other. And this is actually part of that black-white phenomenon. So my group is right, and everything else is wrong. If you're in my group, you're right. And if you're not in my group, you're wrong. And again, we see this among some of our community, and you'll see it among extremist groups in all the camps. In a global context, one of the interesting things about extremism in all the camps is that it tends to be anti-intellectual. And it tends to be anti-traditional. Even for us and for Christians and for others, it tends to be anti-theological. In other words, it's not interested in the tradition as such. It's not interested in the classical tradition as such. It wants a quick fix, and it focuses on particular issues. It doesn't go into great depth. Often in extremist groups, there is a spirituality. If there were not a spirituality, they wouldn't be able to continue. They wouldn't be able to hold together. But But that spirituality is a direct personal spirituality that comes from association with the group and the empowerment that comes from the group. In other words, again, it's not a traditional, if you will, theologically based spirituality. For us, it's not a traditional type of spirituality. Extremist groups tend to shift from religion per se to religious commitment. Does that make sense? In other words, it's not like the traditional way of imbibing the tradition, believing in the tradition, taking on the tradition, but the issue becomes commitment, and usually commitment to a cause. And although this is not necessarily wrong, depending on the cause, it can be very harmful because that cause can become everything. That cause can become almost like an idol, a fixation. And in that context, religion often becomes your identity. In other words, not just your belief, not just your practice, but my identity. Okay? As opposed to the others who don't have that identity. And often, especially in a global context, it gives me an identity in a faceless world. So, if a person is alienated, if a person has no life in their meaning, if you live maybe in the slums of Paris, then this gives me identity in a faceless world. My religion becomes my identity. And, of course, religion must be much deeper than that. And, again, this is not just true of us. This is true of the extremist, wherever you find the extremist, whether they're a fascist or a Leninist, a racist, a European racist, an American racist, right-wing, whatever they might be. Extremism often expresses itself in a personal quest for immediately accessible knowledge. In other words, pamphlets. We read pamphlets, we read easy books, immediately accessible knowledge, maybe tapes, CDs, not careful study, not in-depth study. And often, this is in defiance of authority. I mean by that, in defiance of traditional authority, of the schools, the tradition, the teachers. As one of the great scholars that I knew in Morocco used to say, who was a great hadith scholar, he would say that I studied hadith all my life. I studied Islam all my life. And a young man who doesn't even pray goes into the movie theater, comes out, buys a pamphlet, and the next day he's calling me a kafir. So this is an example of the quick fix. In other words, immediately accessible knowledge and then defiance of authority. That you who've studied Islam all your life and your grandfather studied it and it's like, I can condemn you in 5 minutes because I read this pamphlet and I saw that what you're doing doesn't suit that. And again, we're not just talking about ourselves. This is typical of extremism wherever you find it. So therefore, the religiosity in extremism is often personal experience, as I said before, and not legacy. It's not legacy. How does extremism relate to tradition? Well, you can look at American right-wing evangelicals and see how that works. And you can look at Jewish extremists and see how that works. selective retrieval of the past. Selective retrieval. In other words, I go back into the Bible, and everything that fits what I want, I take. And what doesn't fit, I leave. So we must be careful too not to be guilty of that. In other words, to go back into the Islamic tradition, which is rich, beautiful, life-giving, and which is the middle way. And then just take the bits and pieces that justify what I want, that preoccupation that I have. And in Islam, in this great tradition that we have, with these great scholars of the past and the present, whenever you take a bit or a piece and you focus on it only, what do we call that? Sectarianism. Sectarianism. That's firqa. That's firqa. And this was the nature of the Khawarij. Right? That they just take one part of the prophetic legacy, they insist upon it, and then they go outside of it. And there were others that did the same thing. But the extremist tends to do that. Extremism is a sickness. And it's very important that we protect ourselves from that. We've got work to do. We've got a community to build. We want justice. We want things to be right. But if we don't follow the footsteps of the Mustafa, of the chosen one, do you think you'll get there? I don't think so. We have to follow his path, don't we? We have to follow his path. We have to respect his teaching, his great legacy. And often, you'll find in the extremist the contention that we are returning to the true tenets of the religion. And you look through the extremists, look at the Jewish settlers in the West Bank, and see what they say. They are the true Jews. They are the ones who are following the Torah. They believe, no matter what other rabbis may say. Look at the Christian evangelicals in the United States. It's their way or no way. So they have the true tenets. And if we look in our own camp, we will see that we also have people among us who will say that this is the true way. These are the true tenets, this pamphlet I have, this newspaper article that I read, this CD that I listened to. And so this is another common characteristic. So there are also other qualities. Ahistorical view of the past, deep sense of immediate crisis. Some of these I'll skip because we don't have much time. But a deep sense of immediate crisis. Do you feel that way? Do you feel that there's a crisis right now? Well, do you? I do. And if I didn't, I think I'd be crazy, right? Yes, of course. We have an immediate crisis. Not one, we've got 1,000. But extremism focuses on that immediate sense of crisis, and it's like they can't let go of it. And, you know, you've got to step back, and you have to have sound leadership, and you have to be wise, and we have to go about things in the proper way. We live in a very complex world. And many of us are filled with anger. And I know that when I saw Lebanon blown off the face of the map, that I was filled with anger as you were filled with anger. Who wasn't who has any sense? Who wasn't who has any decency? But the Prophet said what? لا تغضب, لا تغضب, لا تغضب. Don't lose your temper. Don't be angry. Don't be angry. That's prophetic wisdom. Don't be angry. Anger does nothing, right? Anger's from whom? Shaitan. Control yourself. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam The Prophet ﷺ, when he was in the worst of situations, like the Battle of the Trench, when it looked like the Muslims were going to be exterminated, was he angry? Was his face red with anger? He was ahlam ma yakun. He was completely halim, right? Completely at peace, completely in control. And that is mastery. That is the way of the prophets. The Chinese are very intelligent people, very brilliant people. And, there is a little booklet that you've probably heard of, very popular for people, even in business, called The Art of War by Sun Tzu. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Brilliant. It's a little tiny book. What does he say about anger? He said, if you fight your enemy and you know that he is angry or quick to anger, you have defeated him from the start. Anger is defeat. Anger is defeat. You can never approach your problems from anger unless you want to be defeated. You must obey the Prophet ﷺ. Use your intellect. Follow the way. Get rid of your anger. Take refuge in your Creator. Believe in our Creator. Right? So this is very important. The deep sense of immediate crisis, which often leads to extreme actions. Actions that defeat the purpose, that make the anger greater, that make the situation worse. Often, extremist groups have a problem with modernity. Evangelicals in America are like that. But they use technology. And they use it in a very sophisticated way. So it's strange, isn't it, that they may have an issue with the modern age, but they use technology. Now, I believe that there are three things that we have to consider. And I believe that to talk about extremism, especially in our house, especially among our people, there are three things that we have to consider. The first of them is problems, issues, grievances. That what is it that bothers us? What is it that bothers us? What are the problems that we have? And I say that comes first. Because extremism is not natural. Muslims are peaceful people. Muslims are people of the middle way. And if you look at war and violence over the last 400 years, who are the people that have perpetrated the vast majority of wars over the last 400 years? Muslims? No, not Muslims. Europeans and North Americans. The vast majority of wars, the most destructive wars of all, the most violent wars of all, have been done by other people than us. Okay? So when we begin to behave in a way such as some of us do today, it's like, what's happened? I've been a Muslim for 36 years. I embraced Islam in 1970. Most of you weren't around in 1970. Some of you old graybeards were, like me. But when I became a Muslim in 1970, no one knew what Islam was. And in the Muslim world, nobody cared. Nobody cared. It was as if Islam was dead. And then things changed. And then Islam began to come to the forefront. And there were reasons for this, some good, some bad. But that's also why, if you're going to talk about a sick person, and I believe that an extremist is a sick person, in the description that I've given, then it's sort of like a doctor, that we have to see, what is the problem? How did you develop this heart condition? Well, why do you have high blood pressure? Why is your cholesterol like this, right? And there are reasons for that, so we have to look at those reasons. The next thing that we have to look at is social psychology. In other words, what happens to our minds when we see things that are very difficult to take? And we can't ignore that. Again, when I see Lebanon blown off the face of the map, something happens to me. Something happens to all of us. And you see people who were actually very moderate, and all of a sudden they're not moderate anymore. So we have to talk about that social psychology. We can't ignore that. We can't ignore that. And it's funny because, we as Muslims, we tend to not forget things very well. We do have memories, and it's strange that something can happen like Lebanon being blown off the face of the map, and as soon as it's out of the front page, the American people forgot about it. And the Europeans, I don't know, but I don't think most of them care about it. But the problem is we don't forget. And I remember when the Bosnian massacres were taking place, and you probably remember that it virtually drove me out of my mind. And I still haven't forgotten. And most people have forgotten. So this is also part of the reality. We talk about this all the time, right? But it is a valid issue. We do have to talk about this. And our neighbors around us, they've got to be honest about this too. It takes two to tango. If you want me to be honest with you, you've also got to be honest with me. And we need to talk about these things in an honest way, not with hegemonic discourse. That's a big word. That's a word I like very much. Hegemonic discourse is when I can't say why. Okay, for example, if you take the case of Israel. Israel and the way that it was established, the way that foreign policies have supported it, the constant violations of human rights and international law, why can't we talk about that? And if I can't talk about it, that's hegemonic discourse. That's hegemonic discourse. And we can't have that. We have to have free, open discussion in a nice, friendly way. But there's no statute of limitations. Statutes of limitations, as you know, is that if I do something, as you know, maybe I have 5 years to take you to court. And if I don't take you to court in 5 years, I can't take you to court after that. That's statute of limitations. But, when it comes to victims of oppression, people whose lands were taken away without their will, people who were tortured or killed, massacred, like the Bosnians and others, there's no statute of limitations. It's not like after 5 years you can't talk about that. And again, whatever the world community may or may not feel, if they really care about Muslims and they really want to solve these problems, then we must talk about the whole situation. We must be able to sit down and talk about it. We can't put it under the table. That will never work. There was a great Christian theologian in Chicago named Reinhold Niebuhr. And I often go to teach at the college that he came from, Elmhurst College. It's a great college. And Reinhold Niebuhr talked about love, about Christian love. He was a great Christian theologian. And he said that, love is indeed an attribute of Christ. Jesus came to teach love, but there can be no love without justice. There can be no love without justice. There must be justice. There must be an agreement. There must be a solution. And whatever anybody says, if we're not honest about this, then we're talking pure Walt Disney. Pure Walt Disney. And nothing will come of it except for more difficulty. So, this is part of it. Now, something that's not part of it is the problem of modernization. Modernization is not part of the problem. Muslims have been fully modernized since World War II. And many Muslim countries way before that. So the idea that, Muslims are not modernized, what are you talking about? We don't ride camels. Every Muslim country has been modernized. They've all been modernized since World War II. We also have mass education. We have mass readership. We have mass media. The problem is not that we don't accept democracy. And there have been studies, Zogby polls and others, that have asked Muslims, even the radical Muslims, what they think about democracy. And more radical Muslims want democracy than right-wing evangelicals in the United States. So that's not an issue. The vast majority of the Muslim world wants democracy. They want freedom. They want to be able to vote. They want to have a part in the government of their countries. And of course, there is also the problem that there are problems on the outside, there are issues on the outside, and there are also issues on the inside. And it is a fact, admitted by scholars who study the Muslim world, that the authoritarian regimes of the Muslim world that brutally mistreat their people are a major factor in extremism, without any question. And in fact, as great scholars have shown, like Gilles Capel and Olivier Roy, to the extent that the regime is authoritarian and oppressive, you will find that the extremist movements are more and more radical. There's a direct relationship. So just as we look at grievances on the outside, it is perfectly valid and absolutely necessary to look at the tyranny of many Muslim states. And this is something that breeds an extremism of the most vicious type. Now, again, we don't have much time, but there's something that we have to also be very honest about. And that is the fact that we also have problems that we are responsible for. And this is a place where I believe we have to begin. That you know how our communities are. And most of you know how the Muslim world is. And it's true. There are many ways to explain the problems of the Muslim world. This happened, that happened, this regime is this way. But how are we in our families? How are we in our communities? How do we treat our children? How do we treat each other? How do we treat our wives? Are we just? Are we fair? Because we will be judged by this. And this is again why, we must be honest about everything. We can't just point to the other There is a problem there, and we will talk about it, and we will look at it. But there's also a problem in me. There's also a problem in the way that I treat my children. There's also a problem in the way that I treat myself. There's also a problem in the way that I treat my wife. And this we must deal with immediately. We must make our communities communities of justice and fairness and honesty and transparency. That is our obligation before our Lord. And what success can I expect if I don't clean my own house? We have so many problems. We have so many issues. We have so many grievances that we could go on and on and on. But we also have a problem in our own house. And you know that much better than I. You know the details. I don't know your community. You're good people. I'm very honored to be with you. I know my community in Chicago. I know a lot of things I don't want to mention to you because it wouldn't be right for my people. But I know a lot of things I would be embarrassed to speak about. And most of us have things like this. So it's very important for us to look critically at ourselves and to clean our own house, to set our own house in order. And sometimes when we look at the other problems only, then it becomes escapism. In other words, it's running away from responsibility. We must face up to the responsibility. And this is why I like very much what the brother said. When I came into Islam in 1970, I would go to, these annual Muslim gatherings like the ISNA convention you have today. In those days, it was MSA. Today, we have 7 million Muslims in the United States. In 1970, we didn't have 120,000. Isn't that amazing? 120,000. Today in Chicago, we have 350,000. That's amazing. In those days, we'd go to our MSA convention, as we called it. Today, ISNA, you have thousands of people there. Thousands of people there. In those days, we'd have a conference and we'd have a couple of hundred. And we'd be so happy. And it was beautiful for me. I remember those conferences so well. I was a new Muslim. I prayed next to my brothers and sisters. I saw a brother from Indonesia who was like a saint. And I saw another one from Egypt. I just loved him so much. He was an incredible man. His name was Al-Asal. It's like the honey salesman. He sells honey. He was beautiful. He was so incredible. So that was so wonderful. But what we used to talk about in those conferences is that Allah does not alter the condition of a people until they alter the condition in themselves, right? The verse that was the verse always that was on the wall. It was always on the big banner. And everybody talked about it. And even though in those days, most of the issues that I've talked about, which are real issues, like the suffering of the Palestinian people, we talked about that. We talked about more than that. But we always came back to, we must change ourselves. And that is the Quranic imperative. Look at yourself. Look at yourself. As Umar used to say, حاسبوا أنفسكم قبل أن تحاسبوا. حاسبوا أنفسكم. He said, take yourselves to account before you're taken to account. Okay, before I start blaming this one and this one and this one, and he did this to me, and she did this to me, and he did this to me. It's like, what did I do, right? Begin with yourself. That's hard, isn't it? Because this self is like a shaitan. This self is like Pharaoh, right? He's like, and especially if we're pious Muslims, this self, as Rumi says, he's like Pharaoh dressed in the robe of Moses, right? So I pray, I fast, I'm so good, but what do you do that's wrong? And on the day of judgment, you will be asked, how did you treat your wife? Was it right? Was it fair? How did you treat your daughter? Did you educate your children? Did you make your mosque the way it should have been? How were your schools? Were they real schools? Did they teach everything that had to be taught? Did you fulfill the duties that were upon you? Because there are many. There are many. You'll be asked about that. I'll be asked about that, right? And you all know what fardul ayn is. Individual responsibility. You have to pray, you have to fast, you have to make hajj, you have to pay zakat, right? You have to bear witness to the oneness of God. That's the first thing. 5 pillars. We all know that. What about fardul kifaya? Which is the obligation that falls upon us as a community to have education, to have health, to have supporting services, to take care of the insane, to take care of the abused, to help people, to have doctors, to have lawyers, to have jobs, to have wealth in the community. Those are obligations. Those are fard kifaya. And what do our scholars say about fard kifaya? Most of you know that. That if the fard kifaya is not fulfilled, I am a sinner and you are a sinner. If we don't have everything we need in this community to make this community strong, even psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers and businesses and money and good houses and good heating and live a good way of life, then I am athim. I am iniquitous. That is our law. Even though I didn't do it, I'm not responsible. But I am athim, right? Until it's done. That is the law of Islam by consensus. So it's not enough. I mean, you have, mashallah, look at this beautiful mosque. And I've heard so much about this beautiful mosque. And I've heard so much about you beautiful people. And you come in here in Ramadan, you fill the whole mosque, right? And you pray Taraweeh. And you do so much good. Is that enough? Is that enough? That's all that Islam is? That we pray, we fast, we make hajj, we pay the zakat? Is that all? No. And even though you're the most pious person, and you pray your prayer, if you neglect these children, if you neglect these women, if you neglect the housing, if you do not develop the schools, if you don't get rid of the drugs, and I speak about myself as much as you, then we are iniquitous. And ask any scholar here if I'm not telling the truth. That is the way fardul kifaya works. And it's very important. We have a social obligation to build this community, to build our communities. And I can promise you that the day we build these communities, as inshallah we will build these communities, the other problems we will begin to take care of in the most intelligent and the most wise way, the most praiseworthy way. And then we will be participants in the solution. We will not be the problem. And we're not the problem. And we will not be part of the problem. We will be part of the solution. So charity begins at home, right? I have to get my community together. If I tell you about my community in Chicago, you would not believe. I like Birmingham. They told me it was the Chicago of England. I love Chicago. It's a rough, tough city. Birmingham's not like that, but Chicago is. Chicago's beautiful. It's beautiful. But we have some rough areas. We've got some big problems. And I don't want to tell you about them. Really, because some of them are so terrible. But I know what they are. I have to do something about them, right? That's my responsibility. Your responsibility is Birmingham. Really, it is. You've got to build this community. And you are. You're doing a wonderful job. Your children are in better condition than you were, right? They're getting education. They're being taken care of. They're coming up. I know that. There's an incredible improvement in this community. Even if you take Muslims who came to Birmingham as workers, underclass, living in poor white areas, A lot of times you'll find today that those whites are still where they were, and the Muslims have moved up. That's not uncommon, and you know much more about that than I do. But I know that's a fact, because I've been told it's a fact. So we can do it. You know, we are people who belong to one of the greatest civilizations that was ever seen on earth. We are the people who brought the earth to life, time and time again. And that's not exaggeration. That's not apologetics. And that's what we have to do. You know, we should be a light in Birmingham. And inshallah, we will be a light in Birmingham. You know, we will be a solution for problems. And once that happens, wait and see what happens. We will then be able to take part, inshallah, in the solution of the other problems, one by one. You know, charity begins at home. Get your house together, get my house together. And then we go from there to another one and another one in a wise way that is worthy of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so I'm told to get moving. In any case, I think the rest of it probably doesn't need to be, we don't need to, you know, I wanted to talk about social psychology. I wanted to talk about ideology. Basically, I've got no time. So let's just say a word. That, you know, we believe in Islam. We believe in this beautiful law, this prophetic law that was given to us, which is rich and beautiful and wonderful, which I find intoxicating. Study the law and tell me if it's not. With its maxims, its principles, its jurisprudence. This is one of the greatest legal systems that ever was in the world. And it certainly is one of the oldest continuous systems in the world. We don't break the rules of our law. We follow our law. Our law is very wide. It's very generous. It's very broad. But I want to tell you something. There is something that is worse than breaking a law. And that is breaking a psyche. That is breaking a psyche. And when you break a psyche, you can't repair it. You break a law, you take the punishment. You break a law, you do the kafara, you do the atonement. You ask forgiveness, you make it up. When you break a psyche, how do you fix that? I mean, you know, you look in the Muslim world at some of the people, like let's take the Afghans. Do you realize that there are Afghans who never saw a day of peace in their lives, who were born in war? There are a lot of Palestinians like that. They were born in war. They grew up in war. All they know is war. Most of them are orphans. What kind of a psyche does that create? But especially in our community, we're faced with all kinds of problems, and we have to protect these psyches. And the problems that we're faced with, if we don't control them, and if we don't begin to work, then the psyche gets broken. If you stay in a state of anger, and I said already, you've got to get rid of the anger. Get over it. Get to work. You know, look at yourself. There's work to do here. And that doesn't mean to ignore the other things, you know, but get to work. Then the psyche will be healthy. When we don't do that, and we scream and we shout and we look at the problems, but we're not doing anything, then the psyche's broken. And when the psyche's broken, what do you do about it? And then we could talk about ideology. And there are some ideologies out there that are very strange. But again, why do people accept stuff like that? I mean, I've seen that happen. I've seen people accept ideologies that it's like, they don't make any sense. They're crazy. But then again, you have to look at that person. You have to look at that psyche. You have to look at the situation. So, coming back to where we began, what is the solution? I don't believe there's an easy solution. But I do believe that the solution begins right here. And it begins by getting to work. It begins by getting, the community back on its feet. To continue to do what you're already doing, but to do it better and better and better. And to make this community into an example, a model for other communities. And having said all of that, and left you no time, I turn over the floor to questions. No questions. I'm off scot-free. Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead. You raise your hand. Look, he's looking so funny. Okay, go ahead. Wa alaikum salam. Well, I didn't do that, I'm not going to be the one that gets lynched. That was the authorities who did that. Yeah, I thank them.
I would like to say it's very wonderful for all of us to come to these, very spiritually uplifting, invigorating talks. But the fact is, the reality of our situation as Muslims is pretty grim. In England, anyway, I've just moved over from Ireland, and the situation in Ireland is very different. The Muslims are very involved, very integrated. They have their identity, but they're completely part of the society. And there are historical reasons for that. But the fact is, as a newcomer to England, I'm shocked at the problems, particularly with regards to the way the women are treated. And I know that's a controversial issue, but I actually think there's an extreme situation where the Muslim women are treated as a non-entity and just barely tolerated. And that's a huge generalization, I realize, because there are some wonderful brothers as well. But generally, in the masjids here, there's almost always a problem when you go into the masjid. It's almost a physical reaction to your presence there. And that's an extreme position, following on from your lovely discussion this afternoon, where the reality of the feminine is completely disregarded in the current state, in the West, in England in particular. And I just would like maybe to give us, as men and women, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, daughters and sons, some advice as to how we can bridge that and get over this almost schizophrenia that we're suffering from.
When I was in Saudi Arabia, I follow a school, and my school is the Maliki school. And one of my teachers was Dr. Khaldun al-Ahdab, who is a great muhaddith, and I think he's one of the greatest in this time. And he's also a great scholar of Islam. He's a very close friend, and he was a teacher and a colleague, a master of hadith. I don't think there's anyone equal to him in the Muslim world. And I believe very strongly in the Maliki school. I love the Maliki school. And I respect the Hanafi school. And I respect the other schools. And I respect the opinions. Islam is a religion of dissent. It's a religion of many opinions. But one of the things he used to tell me is that if you go back to the hadith, you'll find that it's very expansive. You'll find that it's very expansive. And I believe that when it comes to gender issues in particular, that we need to go back and to look at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Medina. And we may be surprised to find there that a lot of the positions that we take were not the way it was in the days of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there's a very great book that was written by a great muhaddith who was a Salafi. His name is Abu Shaqqa. Abu Shaqqa studied with Al-Albani and with a number of other scholars. He was a Salafi. And in studying hadith, he's an Egyptian, and in studying Bukhari and Muslim, he noticed that many of the things he was being told were not like the hadith that he was reading. So he wrote a book, which I know some of you, especially Arabs, would know, called تحرير المرأة في عصر النبوءة, The Liberation of Women in the Age of Prophecy. This is a book that's 4 volumes, based on several hundred hadith from Bukhari and Muslim. He didn't use other books of hadith because he wanted to use what was completely authentic. That if I give a hadith from Bukhari, you won't doubt it, or Muslim. Whereas if I cite a hadith from Tirmidhi or Ibn Majah or Abu Dawood, you'll say, well, maybe it's not sahih, which it might not be. And he was a great man, Abu Shaqqa. And read his book. I ask you, read his book. Because what he shows is that gender relations in the day of the Prophet were very open. Don't prohibit the maidservants of God from the mosques of God. That's what the Prophet said. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Sahih hadith. And the women took part in life. They took part in battle. Ash-Shifa, who was one of the most noble women of Quraysh, who belonged to the clan of Abd Shams. The Prophet put her in charge of the marketplace. He put her in charge of the marketplace, which also means that there are women in the marketplace that were selling. And whom do we follow? Do we follow the Prophet? Of course we follow the Prophet. So when there are hundreds of hadith like this, can't we follow these hadith? Can't we look at this? Especially when we live in a society like the society that we're in. I mean, a lot of the positions that we take are just culture from the other world. A lot of the positions that we take, they may even be positions in your school. But let's look at the hadith. Let's look at the precedents. Let's look at the situation that we're in. And it's not just an issue of letting women in the mosques. It's not just an issue of educating women completely. I mean, let's be honest. Let's be honest. I know about my community. Some of the things that happen to women are unspeakable. They're unspeakable. And no man would stand for that. No man who's a true man would stand for that. Right? I mean, manhood is to stand up for the rights of the weak. Right? To stand up for the rights of women. To stand up for the rights of children. And I know in my own community that there are terrible things that happen to women. And nobody says anything. No one does anything. The men deny it. Maybe that doesn't happen in your community. I'm not condemning you. I'm not talking about you. But gender is very important. And justice is very important. We have to do right by each other. We have to get the house together. We need to be serious about these things. We need to be open-minded. Again, we talked about these huge issues. I would love in the United States, in any discourse, to be able to talk honestly about Israel. Not to damn it, not to condemn it, but let's just look at what happened. Let's just look at the history, right? Why don't we teach this in school? Just the facts, nothing else, just the facts. And quite frankly, I can't do that. Quite frankly, it's very difficult to do that. Why? Hegemonic discourse. Hegemonic discourse. You may not ask why. You may not ask that question. You're an anti-Semite if you do that. No, I'm not an anti-Semite. Not at all. Not in the least. I never would be. And I have nothing against the Jews. But just let's talk about it. You can't do that. But at the same time, we want to talk about these things, right? We want to talk about these issues. But at the same time, in our own community, no hegemonic discourse. No wrath and anger. Just talk about it. What does Islam say about it? What is the reality? What are the opinions? What is there? What can we do about this situation? How can we expect others to allow us to have free discourse on the issues that concern us if we're not going to allow free discourse in our own community? It doesn't sound right to me. Does it sound right to you? Are we finished? Yes, go ahead.
Isn't Islam an ideology, and doesn't Islam commit scholars to a cause to spread the truth and to prevail it over other way of life?
The question is, doesn't Islam require us to spread the truth and to make it prevail over other ways of life?
Isn't it an ideology?
Sorry?
Isn't it an ideology?
Isn't it ideology? Well, the Quran says 3 times. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره الكافرون ولو كره المشركون. He, God, is the one who sent his messenger with the guidance and with the religion of truth, so that he, God, make it uppermost, make it prevail over all other religion, even if those who reject the truth, the idolaters, don't like it. This is the work of God. This is the work of God. And we do that, how? In this situation, by being examples. You know, by getting on the front page of the newspaper because of the wonderful things we do. Not because of the atrocious things that so-and-so did or so-and-so did, right? And Islam spread through the earth by examples, by excellent examples. It didn't spread by the sword, you all know that. Tell me a single instance where Islam spread by the sword. Never. I can tell you other religions that spread by the sword, but not Islam. For Islam to come into Egypt, it took almost 300 years. You know, for it to become the majority of the people of Egypt. Syria, almost 350 years. There were, of course, Muslim communities. They were strong, they were beautiful. But Islam spreads, you know, by its own light. Yes, you know, we have a message to take. And I believe that it is the message of the time. Again, you know, modernity, this age in which we live, this economic system that we are part of, it needs guidance. It needs values so that we can have peace, so that we have human rights, so that we can have justice, so that we can protect the environment, so that we can protect the children and the women, the orphans, the children that are starving in Africa, and the AIDS, the victims of AIDS, and so forth. I mean, you know, the culture in the modern world has many, many wonderful aspects to it. But there's so much that is left out. I mean, my own country wants to militarize space. Did you know about that? That's nothing to laugh about. I'm certainly not proud of that. Militarization of space is one of the greatest threats to humanity there is. And yet there are people that want to do that. Is that culture? Is that value? Is that guidance? So we are here to be lights of guidance. We are here to help humanity in any time. And that is what Muslims have done time and again in West Africa and elsewhere. In Indonesia, in Malaysia, in China. Muslims have played very dynamic roles. But you do it by being what you're supposed to be and by doing the things that you have to do, not by shouting at people, and not even by passing out pamphlets. In the United States, we have a lot of converts, more than you have here. Almost 1/3 of our community to 40% of our community is converts. Mostly African Americans, but they're converts. About 4% of your community, to my knowledge, is converts. And that's great, that's wonderful. But ours is about 40%. And I know, I'm a convert, I know a lot of other converts. Do you know a convert that ever became a Muslim because of a khutbah? Or because of a speech? Or because of a pamphlet? Do you? I don't. I don't know a single one. Every convert that I know and that I've read about, how do you think they came to Islam? How did I come to Islam? Through a person that you love, through a friend, through a contact. This is the key. And that person might be alive and the person might be dead. In my case, it was Malcolm X, whom I loved very much, and I will love to the day I die. But I loved Malcolm X, and thousands of Americans loved him, and they came into Islam through him. Whites, Hispanics, blacks. Malcolm was a wonderful human being, a great human being, a man of truth, a man of honesty, integrity. He could not be corrupted. And we loved him. And I followed him to the faith. I would have never come into the faith, I don't believe, except through him. Even if you'd given me books about it. But it was Malcolm. It was Malcolm. And to follow Malcolm, to take the way of Malcolm. And this is really important, because if you want to do what you just said, then you've got to take people's hands. You've got to have friends. You've got to reach out. You've got to open your doors. You've got to help people, right? And you're good at that. You're good people. You're generous people. If somebody came to your house to eat, you would give them the most beautiful feast in the world, wouldn't you? I know you would. Because Muslims are, first of all, they're the best cooks in the world. Their wives are. There are exceptions to that. But they're generous people. Muslims are generous. I've been around the Muslim world. And when it comes to generosity, I've never seen the likes of that. I know Muslims that were dirt poor, and they'd give me everything they have, even though I don't want it. You know, and they'd go out, honestly, believe it or not. I knew a Moroccan who had nothing but his burnous. His burnous, his wool overgarment. And guests came to his house. I was one of those guests. He went out and sold his burnous to buy food and to serve us. He sold the coat off his back. Is that generosity? I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And I'm astounded to this day. And I've seen this many times. People who give you everything they have. I knew a poor man who was a teacher of mine. He didn't have a penny. He didn't even have shoes. He had little sandals. And yet he would never take a rial from me. Never take 30 cents from me. Even though I wanted to give him like more and more, he wouldn't take anything from me. Always he gives me something. Always give me a sandwich. Give me a sandwich. He would give me a Fanta, orange drink. I mean, we were generous people, mashallah. We were generous people. And so what I'm saying is, make friends. Help people. And if you're interested in spreading the truth, that's how you do it. Because that's how people come in. You know, they know this person. And listen, it doesn't happen overnight. Most converts come into Islam anywhere between 4 and 10 years. Not overnight. It takes time. It takes time. And again, you have to be honest. You have to be good. Be yourself, right? You're a friend. You're a helper. And you don't like the news. I don't like the news. What do you do about the news? Well, there are a lot of things. You could get on television yourself. Get a good spokesman. You know, you all know Azhar Osman, right? He's on our board of directors, I'm so proud to say. And in his stand-up comedy, you know, he has this one piece about, Uncle, let me explain you. You know, Uncle, let me explain you. And you don't want to get Uncle, let me explain you on the television. You know, I mean, other people, get another spokesman on the television. Another spokeswoman. You could do that, but if you're a friend of these people out here, or our people out there in America, you'll see the news doesn't affect them the same way. It doesn't. It doesn't affect them the same way. The ones who are really affected are the ones who don't know us, or the ones who know us in a bad way. And again, I could go back to my own city and tell you something really bad, but I'm not going to tell you that. Okay, so you make friends, you help people, do ihsan, and inshallah, we will all succeed. You're on the winning team. You are. You didn't know that, did you? You're on the winning team. We don't bet in Islam, but if I were a bettor, I'd bet on you. You're the winning team. Time and time again in history, you're knocked down, but you get back up. But you always become beautiful. You always make the world beautiful. You build the most beautiful buildings. You build the most beautiful schools. You teach, right? You build the most beautiful cities. This is our legacy. And, may we be able to do that. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم ما مننت به علينا فتممه وما أنعمت به فلا تسلبه وما علمته فاغفره وما سترته فلا تهتكه تمام نعمتك ودوام عافيتك يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك نستغيث أصلح لنا شؤوننا كلها ولا تكلنا إلى أنفسنا ولا إلى أحد من خلقك طرفة عين ولا أقل من ذلك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم بسر الفاتحة.